Good evening. My name is Yehuda Friedman, and I work in the Department of Synagogue Services. We want to thank everyone out on the web and everyone who's joining us here in person for this very important seminar on financial management. As the Yom Norum are quickly approaching, this is a time for introspection and for us to examine not only ourselves but also what's happening in our shuls. Certainly when it comes to our inspecting of our finances. I want to thank the panelists, and I will introduce the moderator, Mr. Jake Weichholz. Jake is the director of J.H. Cohn LLP, Accountants and Consultants, serving the nonprofit community. He was a partner at Ernst & Young for 26 years before his retirement. Jake is a past president, chairman of the board, and treasurer of the Young Israel of Woodmere, and currently serves as the chairman of the audit committee at the OU. He's also the chairman of the advisory board. That's the accounting program at Cy Sims School of Business at YU. So without further ado, Jake, please take it away.
Thank you, Yehuda, and welcome everybody. I think you're going to find this to be a very interesting topic, a lot of important concepts you're going to hear today. I caution you, though, the trick is in being able to conceptualize and then practically implement some of the ideas that you hear today. I think the title is Fraud Prevention and Detection. The two key words today are prevent and detect. There are different kinds of controls that financial organizations need to put in. The prevent are the ones up front to prevent any fraud or misappropriation. The detect, unfortunately, it's after the damage has been done. So let's focus today on understanding which are prevent and which are detect controls. So feel free at the end of the presentations to ask questions about those things. We have with us today a number of distinguished people. We have Mel Zachter, all to my far right. Mel is a partner at Loeb and Troper, CPA. Mel is a former audit partner on the Orthodox Union engagement. He's been working for over 40 years in accounting, not-for-profit, so he really is truly an expert in this field, and I'm sure his years of experience and knowledge really come in handy. To his left is Harold Gelernter, also a partner at Loeb and Troper and currently the audit partner on of the Orthodox Union. Harold is also an expert, but not only providing audit but consulting services to both healthcare and not-for-profit organizations, and I'm sure we can learn a lot from Harold today as well. To my far right is Ann Goldberg, the executive director at Avas Achim, B'nai Jacob and David in West Orange. Before assuming that position in 1998, Anne was the executive director of Congregation Shaarei Tzedek in Vancouver. She has a degree in business administration and a certificate in fundraising management. The program is we're going to start with a slideshow by Mel and Harold, and then that'll be followed with some practical insights from Anne, and then we'll take some questions, and hopefully we'll be able to address all your issues. Mel?
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be here. And both Harold and myself will be presenting this session, the first part of it, before we give it over to Ann. And we're trying to key into internal controls and things that are really relevant to you out there, the synagogues, the shuls that are out there. And certainly, from our experience and from these slides, we hope to impart that knowledge to you. Unfortunately, we read in the newspapers almost every day about different frauds that go on, embezzlements, and certainly just today I read another one. Unfortunately, it's larger than life. It's out there, and certainly we need to focus in what we as individuals, we as board people of shuls, what we could do to avoid this in our own shop. The specific areas that Harold and I will be discussing are enumerated here. I won't read it, but it's there for your information. And certainly we all understand what fraud is, what misappropriation, but we've given you the quote from the dictionary in case you need a reference. Certainly, it's very important that we try to prevent fraud, as Jacob mentioned. Is it really possible to prevent fraud? The answer is certainly not. We can't always avoid fraud. There are people out there that can try to avoid whatever internal controls you have, but certainly we have to put in our best efforts to put in those controls. And certainly with the proper internal controls, we could mitigate whatever problems may come about. The question is, why do we fail sometimes? Not just we, but the public out there, whether it's nonprofit organizations or commercial entities, anyone out there. Fraud happens. Unfortunately, it happens much too much. Question is, why does it happen so frequently? So we've enumerated a few things here, and maybe we could learn from these items, and maybe we could take it back and say, what are we doing, or what could we do in order to avoid and be able to detect and prevent fraud? Sometimes there's an over-reliance on inquiries. You may ask the treasurer a question. You may ask the bookkeeper a question. And too often, you ask the questions. You may even get an answer, hopefully. But we rely upon the specific questions too often without having people delve into what's really happening out there. We should delve into what really happened, what the activities were, what occurred, and what should have occurred. And we'll discuss some of the areas that we should focus in on, but certainly inquiries are fine, but an over-reliance upon inquiry is not good. A lack of an awareness. Sometimes we're not aware of certain situations, which we should be. We take it for granted that everything is working out well. It's great to have that attitude, but sometimes we have to be a little skeptical. And certainly, we have to be more aware of what's going on in our shuls, financially and otherwise. And as the old saying goes, sometimes the oilam is a goyim, and we have to be more aware and not to fall into that area. Certainly, we're all very busy, we all work, we all have other endeavors, and sometimes we're just too pressured, too busy to really get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening and to spend the necessary time. But certainly, I think one key thing that we should all take out from this session is, as a board person, as a treasurer, as a president, you do have a great responsibility. You've taken on this task, kol hakavod to you that you've done it, but certainly besides the kavod comes work, and we all have to be attuned to that there's no free lunch. We need to do the work, and all our members rely upon you to make sure that happens. Some of the overall administrative controls that we want to focus in on initially is certainly, whether you call it an audit committee or a finance committee, it's important that a separate committee be established by your shul to oversee the finances, to raise questions, to get reports, to certainly make sure that you're up to date on your finances, on your reports. And it's important that this committee meet on a regular basis. The different reports that are generated should be, certainly initially there should be a budget that's adopted, which will reflect the revenue and expenses broken down by different details of sources of revenue, types of expenses. And this committee should be able to compare your various actual versus budget revenue and expenses. And certainly there are schools out there that do it better than others, meaning that some things are more seasonal than others, whether it's your annual dinner, whether it's another function, or certain expenses just occur in certain months and not others. So what you should try to do is budget month by month and try to determine where revenues are coming in so you could compare it and compare apples and apples. And that's very important in order to understand what's going on. But certainly if there are variances, we should understand why there are variances. Whoever your bookkeeper is should be able to give you that information on a monthly basis and to monitor it. And the committee should make sure they understand, and not only understand, but agree with why these things are happening. And certainly if things are out of whack, one way of doing it is modifying the budget. Another way is maybe cutting certain expenses in midstream if necessary, if possible. There are many things that we need to do and monitor on a regular basis. We've seen too many organizations just let things go, and unfortunately, those organizations are no longer in business. So again, it's important that we all look in that area. We should have the committee not only meet with the bookkeeper, the treasurer obviously, but also maybe meet if you have an outside accountant that comes in, whether it's to do an audit or a compilation or a review. They should meet with him to discuss what's going on and also to discuss internal controls. So these are important aspects that we should make sure is happening. Some other overall administrative controls that you should consider is whether you have directors and officers insurance. Many schools do not. Some schools do, and this is something that you should consider. God forbid a large fraud could wipe out the school, things that they may have been capturing funds for a building or other special projects, and God forbid this could devastate that project, could devastate the shul and the reputation of the shul. So I think that's a consideration that we should all consider. Again, a lot of the things we're talking about are practical things. Some may be more relevant to your shul, some may be less relevant. So everyone has to keep that in mind and make that determination. The cash flow of the organization needs to be monitored, and if the cash flow is poor, less than what was anticipated, you have to understand why. Also, God forbid, if you run into a cash flow situation, you should have a source, whether it's a bank to have a line of credit, or whether it's to have one or two gevirim in the community that you said, hopefully we won't need it, but would you lend us a hand on a short-term basis if we need to get over this crunch situation? So these are important administrative things. We're going to go into some more specifics. The first being cash receipts. Again, there are some schools out there that may accept cash. Some communities may have it more than others. It's something that we should try to avoid if possible, because cash, unfortunately, makes fraud more vulnerable to the public out there and to an individual. So something that we should make sure is controlled. Certainly receipts, whenever cash is given, certainly should be a cash receipt for that donation should be given immediately. And obviously duplicate copies of that receipt should remain within the entity, should be numerically sequenced so that there is control over cash. When you issue checks, certainly you should consider, as many organizations do, that you may have one person able to sign checks below a certain level, but make a determination that over a certain level that there should be a second signature that's required. Again, each shul has to make that determination who the authorized signatures are. I've seen too often, some of them may have been president a dozen years ago, who has been inactive for 10, 12 years, and still an authorized signature. That's a little ridiculous. And certainly you should keep your authorized signatures current and make sure it makes sense. Certainly when you get receipts, you should log them in. You should do a batch and make sure that batch hopefully corresponds with your bank deposit. Make sure the deposits are made on a timely basis and regularly, so there's no lapping, meaning checks are held back, and that's a way of kiting and causing problems with your internal control. Whenever a check is received, it's important that there be a stamp immediately for deposit only, the name of the shul, the account number. That's critical. Unfortunately, I've seen more than once where checks in good faith made out to a nonprofit organization never ends up in the shul's account. An individual opened up an account, coincidentally happened to be in the exact same name or a similar name as the organization, and he was the only authorized signature. And you know what happens then? There's something, and you're going to say, oh, they need a board resolution, they need this and that. Again, there are ways that this could happen behind the scene, and certainly it's important to avoid these issues and these problems, and there should be immediately, for deposit only, stamp on the checks that you receive. One of the ways of controlling this problem of a third party opening up his own account is, one of the controls is to, obviously, you have a receivable statement, you have a receivable schedule, and obviously if the check did not go into the account, hopefully there's a control from the general ledger what gets credited to receivable based upon cash receipts. So it's important to monitor that the cash receipts are posted correctly against the receivables, and then you should compare on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, the accounts receivable schedule, the detailed listing of members, what they owe, whether it's for membership, whether it's for co-nidra, whatever the situation is, and make sure that it ties out to your general ledger. And obviously the way of doing that is by posting receivables into your general ledger. And I think that's an important control to make sure that happens. And when you have receivables, make sure you send out bills on a regular basis. So if someone took a check unauthorized and put it into a different account, hopefully Yankel, the member of yours, will say, hey, I paid this bill. I paid it 2 months ago. Why am I getting a bill? Hopefully he'll raise the question to the treasurer, to the financial secretary, and that will cause concern and hopefully get to the bottom of the issue. Another area which is critical, not only important, but it's critical that bank reconciliations be done on a regular basis. Again, if there's an issue of fraudulent checks that are written from your account, whether it's from your check stock or whether it's from made-up stock that unfortunately is happening too often, hopefully by doing your bank rec, you'll be able to reconcile your general ledger to your bank statement and thus uncover these problems. You should also, an independent party, not the bookkeeper, but maybe the treasurer or another board member, should go through the checks to see if there's any unusual items, whether it's a signature that doesn't look like an authorized signature, whether it's unusual items. So this is important that we should all look into the bank reconciliations. And whoever does the bank reconciliation, it should be reviewed by someone of a higher authority, whether it's the treasurer, whether it's another person who's astute in finances. We should certainly look into it. Cash disbursements, again, make sure your petty cash is a reasonable amount. Don't overdo it. Cash lying around is not healthy. You should look into what your turnover is. Is it too much? Should you really, is not necessary. Are you paying real bills from cash, from your petty cash? That's something that we should look into. Again, when you get a petty cash slip, you should try to avoid it, stamp it after it's paid so it doesn't come back and try to get paid again. And the checks themselves should be controlled in a secure area under lock and key so that there's no issues with losing those checks or someone going there and pulling out the last number of checks and making out checks which is not authorized. The check should be used in numerical sequence, so that's an important control feature that we should make sure that happens. Again, when you pay normal invoices, again, stamp them. Make sure that they are authorized, obviously, by the party involved in the area, whether it's maintenance, whether it's synagogue services or whatever, and certainly make sure they get stamps so they don't come back again. If you get supplies, make sure you get receiving reports, and make sure you have all the authorizations necessary. Certainly, unfortunately, when you have a special event, sometimes, I need, give me 5 checks so I could give out the check to this one and this one eventually, and, sign the checks and I'll take care of it. Don't worry, I'm a buddy, and obviously I'll use it just for the intended purpose. Again, for control purposes, checks should never be signed in blank. That is a no-no, and certainly we all understand why. When there are wire transfers, again, make sure that just transfer from one account to another account and that you have a trail, why you're doing it, who authorized it. Even an email is fine if the president authorizes it or treasurer, but you should have some sort of form of control and a way of determining why it happened, when it happened. Again, one last important thing is, again, it's important that the board be involved on a regular basis, and who signs the checks, as I said before, is critical. And we should look at who the authorized signatures are today. Does it make sense? Does it require one signature? Does it require 2 signatures? And what are the criteria? Is everyone aware of it? And make sure the bank is notified as well. I'm going to hand it over to Harold Gelernter to take us through the rest of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mel. Hopefully, some of the shuls over the years have been able to squirrel away, after many years, some funds, and have been able to actually not only have funds to meet operations and payroll, but also set aside for special projects and have put it aside in an investment portfolio. And some of the things that should be looked at is, do we have an established asset allocation plan? Are we dealing with a balanced portfolio that would minimize the risks that are involved with investments? As we know, over the last couple of years, the fluctuations of the market, we should look at our portfolio. How much of it is in fixed income investments? How much in equities? Something that became very prevalent about 4 or 5 years ago is something called alternative investments, which are very risky but yield a very high return. I think the shuls, especially, the leadership, the lay leadership, with involvement from the executive director and those that are charged with running the operation, should really sit down and have a allocation plan in place. Who does the investing? Is there an investment counsel, investment advisor? Does he have the full discretion? If not, who does? Who determines when there are purchases, where there's sales of security, the types of securities, that it's within the balanced portfolio plan that was set aside by the investment committee? And who reviews these transactions to see that they are authorized? What's in place? The question, again, going back to the controls surrounding it. If we're dealing with brokers and several brokers but one custodian, we're getting many statements. Who's reconciling all the different accounts? There are timing differences. Who's taking a look and seeing that at the end of the day, all of the money that has been invested and the relative income has been properly reconciled? If we have investments that are on site, whether it be bonds, securities, donated Israeli bonds, which many shuls do get, are they in a secured place? Are they secured in a safe? How often does somebody actually go in and count them to make sure the inventory that we have actually still is in existence? Are they in the name of the organization? If we have a donated security, has the formal paperwork to transfer from the donee to the from the donor rather to the organization, so that now the investment resides in the organization's name and it's able to obtain legally in its name all the investment income that spins off of that investment. And how do we account for it to reconcile that on all the investments that we have, that all the dividends and interest earned have been fully accounted for? Again, when we're dealing with investments, we're dealing with high-level dollars for which we want to make sure that, at least on a monthly basis, that everything is tied together. The total investment portfolio, the earnings on the investment portfolio, any physical investments or securities that we have on hand. On our revenue cycle, are there separate fundraising reports for each event? We should have separate reports from the fundraising department on each event, and those should be compared after the event to the accounting department reports to make sure they reconcile. What about our revenue stream unto itself, our membership revenue? We're approaching the Yom Norayim. We're selling seats, seat revenue. If the shul has either a camp or a school, tuition income, we should be doing tests of the number of members, the number of seats sold, the number of students times the different rates that are being used, membership rates, seat rates. So you have seats that are sold for members have one rate, non-members have another rate, children of members, every shul has their own fee schedule. Same thing with tuition. If there are scholarships for the tuition for the school or camp, who's authorizing what those scholarships are? Is there a scholarship committee that is looking into that, and that we have what the discount to a particular participant in the school or the camp is going to be? Are there systems in place to verify that all our billings have been made? Mel spoke about the accounts receivable. It's very important that we book all of our revenue on the accrual basis, so that we do have a receivable schedule, so that if money does come in, and God forbid somebody does take the money, when statements go out again, the individual who paid will say, I already paid that with check so-and-so, and how come it's not credited to my account? That'll raise the red flag. What about if receivables are sent out and the statements come back? Who is controlling that we're rebilling to make sure we do collect our funds? The review. There should be a review of our age accounts receivable on a monthly basis. Somebody at the lay leadership should be looking, who's paying timely? How old is it? Is there an issue? Do we have a member? Again, in these times, a lot of people have issues that's difficult for them to pay their dues. Can we work out a payment plan? Maybe $25 a month till you catch up. What type of reports are management receiving? Are they user-friendly so they understand by member, by type of service, whether it be dues, whether it be seats, whether it be tuition, any type of special event, that the money that has been billed out has been collected and applied appropriately, and what the age of the outstanding receivable is. On the expense side, some of the controls would be our payroll. Again, if we have a large staff, and even with a small staff, is the payroll expense reconciled to the quarterly 941 that's filed with the IRS? As Mel mentioned earlier, budgets, are they modified by seasonal factors? So, if we are in the high holiday time, we hire cantors, other things, we have a summer camp. Do we look to see that the budget for expenses matches the season that it's in? And are the variances looked at, and who's questioning it, and who are giving the answers, and the answers seem to be reasonable? And if we're uncertain or unclear, do we drill down to see whether the answer does make sense? Again, in larger shuls, do we know who our employees are? There might be several employees that are on the payroll. Are we sure that when we look at the payroll register that these employees actually exist, that there are no fictitious employees? Do we do a payoff at any given time? Again, these are some things that we should consider for reasonableness of the controls to make sure and give us that level of insurance that nothing is taking place out of the ordinary. And finally, to look at the overall salaries of the shul. Do we look at the year-end W-2s to see what the total amount of compensation we paid, and how does that compare to the budget? How does that compare to any contracts that we have with employees to make sure that it is reasonable? What are some of the preventive measures? Well, when we hire employees, do we screen who these employees are? Do we do background checks? Do we look at the vendors that we are dealing with? Who are we doing business with? Could we be doing business with quote-unquote related party vendors? Is the janitorial supplier related to the CFO? We have to take a look at that, make sure that there are arm's-length transactions. When we go out to purchase, is there a competitive bidding system in place? We all know, based on the weather that has happened, a lot of our shuls need major structural repair due to the hurricane and the heavy rains. Are we going out and getting bids from more than one contractor to make sure we're getting the right price for the level of service that we need? Or is the CEO or executive director of the shul or the financial person calling a buddy or a relative of his to do the job and is not getting paid the appropriate price for the job? Is there existing code of conduct and compliance program? Do we have rules and regulations that have been set aside that the employees need to adhere to? Currently, most of the synagogues are not required to file Form 990 with the IRS, although there is talk for the quote-unquote church-exempt synagogues one day to do that. One of the requirements from the Internal Revenue Services standpoint is that all not-for-profits have to have what's called a corporate compliance program in place, and it's something that's asked for, which needs to be described in that form. So a best practice certainly would be is to set rules and criteria for which all employees must follow. And then, do we have an anonymous hotline for whistleblowing? If one employee thinks that another employee, especially a superior, is acting out of character, which could be detrimental to the shul, can they anonymously have a means of contacting where the organization, whereby some member of the board is able to screen that and get an understanding that there could be some issue going on, and then it would be the board's responsibility to delve into it to see if there is any teeth behind it, if it's fact or fiction. What about the overall control environment? Again, larger institutions should consider an internal audit function of some sort for double-checking the activities that are happening on the finance side. And certainly, there should be active investigations of any suspicious activity that is come across, whether it be through the inquiry process, as Mel mentioned at the beginning, or when reviewing reports that are given on the finance department's operations of the shul. Behavioral red flags. We should look to see if our employees are individuals who have high personal debt. They have resentment for their superiors. They seem frustrated with the job that they're doing. They might have a gambling issue, substance abuse issue, an employee who never takes vacation, or those that are territoriality and protectionism, those who have their information very close to the vest, where it's almost impossible to get answers on everything. These are some of the behaviors you should be aware of the shul's employees, and that should raise some red flags to you of whether there could be other important issues that could lead to potential fraud taking place. Some other behavioral red flags. High lavish lifestyle for an employee that is earning $35,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 a year. The employee has low morale. There's a high turnover because the superior continues to turn over lower employees because he doesn't want that employee to catch on to whatever fraud he might be perpetrating. Complete disregard of internal controls when questions are asked of why you're not establishing this type of control or that type of control, and it's asked time and time again, and you never get an answer. They say they'll do it, and the next time you come in and you ask the question, you look at the controls in place, controls are still not established. There's intimidation by management. Unusual working hours. All of a sudden, you see that the bookkeeper is coming in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and leaving at 12 o'clock at night. You're wondering why that individual might be doing that. Maybe they're trying to override the computer system, book entries that during the day where there are other employees that are there, they wouldn't be able to have that latitude to perform. Ignoring complaints. If there are complaints that are being issued and the person is just not listening, you're just wondering what's going on, and just overall poor communication between the employee and the executive staff or the lay leadership. Those are behavioral red flags that each and every one of you should just be on the lookout for. Finally, if you take a look based on surveys, if the bar graph represents 100%, then when you compare the average white-collar crime to armed robbery represents about 10% of the white-collar crime. So, it's not just the guy who holds you up on the street that is getting you. It's the guy that sits in your office with the green eye shades, and he comes and goes every day. You think he's a model employee, but you never know what he's doing behind your back because he might not be following the rules and regulations. At this point, we'd like to turn the presentation over to Ann Goldberg, who will give us the executive director's perspective of establishing controls, which she has done in her synagogue. Thank you.
If there are any questions from the internet audience, feel free to send it in. We are accumulating the questions, and we will try to address them all at the end of the presentations. And if anybody here has questions, you too can provide them.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this tonight. I'm going to try to share some of our best practice with you and things that in my 20 years in the in synagogue business have been trying to implement. I'm the executive director of Congregation AABJ&D in West Orange, New Jersey. And it's a shul of about, I would say, 450 families, and we have a budget of around $1.3 million. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the size that we are. What I've done is trying to do practice versus theory, and I took the presentation that Mel and Harold did, and I tried to put in our own best practice to this. The first thing that I would recommend you to do is to invest into an accounting software that is designed for business, for organization, nothing like Quicken or anything that, to deal with personal finances. The advantage of that is that, you lock your batches, and it prevents people from tampering. You don't have somebody that's come, oh, well, that expense belonged to last month, let me go change this. So you can't do that. If you're going to make any type of changes, they have to be done by journal entry, and there's always a trail. So it helps you keep the accuracy and the integrity of your reports. This is how we deal with cash receipts. So like in my practice, we take all the checks, and it goes by batches, and your batch should equal your deposit. So when you have your bank deposit, and what the batch says, it should be the same amount as Mel explained before. We take photocopies of all the checks. So anything that comes into our office, we photocopy. And the back of it, it's stamped for deposit only, as they mentioned. And we also write the batch number. That has proven to be something very useful, because if you have somebody that calls, say, yes, I paid this bill, and I would ask them to read me the number at the back of the check, and this way we could go back to the batch and see if it was posted to somebody with the same last name or to the wrong code or whatever. But it gives you something to work with, and you could track it for years. Excuse me. And again, as they mentioned, we do deposit on a very timely manner, and we print all the batches and all the material supporting the batch. So, if all the checks, if there was a lot of journal entries, there'll be a batch with all the journal entries. Anything that's non-cash will be in its own separate batch. When somebody comes in with cash, we do what was recommended. We do give them a manual receipt. It is a numbered receipt, and a copy stays in the book. If you're a non-member, we will receipt you on a manual receipt. Otherwise, everything is done through the computer system once a year. Each member gets a tax receipt letter for tax purposes. Every month, we do bank reconciliation. We do have several accounts. We try to keep all our designated fund accounts. If we have an account for, let's say the mitzvah fund, for example, any money that was given for scholarships and whatever, everything is kept separate, and every month we do reconcile every single account, and it's reviewed. It's prepared by the bookkeeper. I review it, and one of the things that I'm suggesting to my board is that it should be the responsibility of the finance committee or the treasurer or the financial secretary to also review it on a monthly basis. In terms of records and reports, we do on a monthly basis. We print all the statement data, which is a copy of every single statement that was sent to the members. We do a report of the charge code summary, the aging report, the cash disbursement journal, the general ledger, the income statement, and the balance sheet. And we do that for our main operating account, and we also do that for our building fund account, which is, in terms of bookkeeping, is done as a separate entity. And hopefully, my finance committee and my and the treasurer and everybody else reviews it on a monthly basis as well. In terms of cash flow and receivables, so the most important thing is to review your aging report on a monthly basis. And personally, I like the statement data better because it allows you to see what the members has paid, what activity they had in a month versus what's left to pay. That's a matter of preference, and it allows you to flag any accounts in arrears and to follow up. So also, as mentioned, this should be your treasurer and finance committee's greatest responsibility. So you should really encourage them to do that on a monthly basis. Yes? Okay. For receivable, we use marks. I'm open to any better suggestions. And for the general ledger, we use Peachtree. And marks feeds into Peachtree, like each batch downloads into it. Yeah. In terms of cash disbursements, talking about petty cash, we carry a float of around $200. It's more than enough, as Mel mentioned. It's just for little things and when you need to pay something cash, but it's very rare. We replenish it as we go along, but and we reconcile it monthly. So if we use only $50 in the month, well, $50 go back at the end of the month, and there's again, everything is supported. The checks, we do what they said. Everything is in numerical order. Everything is kept on the lock, and we never have any blank check that are signed. In terms of billing controls, and to see where you are, how we gauge the overall reasonableness of control is actually the actuals versus the budget. So we do prepare a budget on a yearly basis. We don't break it down on a month-to-month, even though there is we're going in that direction, but at the moment we're not. It's just like too time-consuming. We have a budget committee that meets, I would say, 4 or 5 times before we put a budget together. There's many hours that are invested into the preparation of the budget. Usually it's done by the finance committee, so they're well attuned at what is seasonal and what isn't. So, they should have a good grasp. This is like in the summer, for example, we do all our renovation or any like landscaping and so forth. So they sort of know that, at that time of the year, building maintenance will be high versus the school will be low. But when the school kicks in, they will know. So, but we, as I said, we produce a P&L statement on a monthly basis within the balance sheet. So it's pretty easy to check your actual versus budget and see if you're on track or if any type of unusual thing is happening. I do keep a separate spreadsheet for all the fundraisers. So like for the dinner, the culinary appeals, the steak membership, whatever appeal you have, I keep a separate accounting of it. It's time-consuming. It's like doing things double, but it has a few benefits relating to your committee chair, for example, your dinner. So each night I would send my dinner chairs an update of the day, so they would know exactly, where we are in terms like how much money is coming in, who's been canvassed, who has pledged. So like they have the pulse of the day of their fundraising campaign, and at the same time, it gives me the ability to compare that to what my bookkeeper builds. So you would catch if something fell through the cracks, like this. So there's some type of a control measure in that instance. Again, we send monthly statement to our members. I know some people are always asking, should we do this bi-monthly, quarterly? We like monthly, and I think it's a great help with cash flow. And also, it allows the members to flag some potential billing errors. They could see right away if something doesn't belong to them or is double billed. If you're trying to do that 3 months or 4 months down the road, it becomes complicated. So it helps for greater accuracy of the statements and billing. In terms of asset management, our Constitution, I don't know, I'm sure yours does as well, governs such a thing as a risk factor of investment. Like we do not keep stocks, bonds, or any type of investment like that because we're supposed to be very, very low risk. If somebody gives us a stock donation, usually we sell it right away, so it never stays in our books. And it also governs who signs and transacts on behalf of the shul. So for us, there's 4 officers, and it's any 2 of the 4th that needs to sign on any check or any transaction. If we don't have a mortgage, but should we have a mortgage, they would be the one applying. Anything that has to do with money, we need 2 signatures. And also our Constitution regulates also the acquisition and disposal of real estate. For any big things, it's all in the Constitution, and at this point, we are in review. We're looking at our control measures. We're looking at our governance and compliances, and all this is being looked at the moment. I think it's good, but we're looking to make it even better and tighter. As I say, it's a good idea to have a review process in place, either to establish compliance or to assess the status of where you are and make recommendations. In my mind, can there be too much controls up there. Like I know in the climate now, everybody's very concerned. Everybody wants transparency. I think it's wonderful. I think if it's done right, it enables people to work more efficiently and with confidence. It protects both the employee and the board members. So in terms of employee, you have policies. If somebody, I don't know, you could always say, our policy is X. So it's not your decision. You're not the bad guy. You're there to implement the policies. And at the same time, it protects your board member as well. It offers greater transparency, and it also helps with the preservation of assets. If there's too much control, but then this is, in my experience, it becomes cumbersome. It fosters micromanagement, and it becomes like annoying if you need 50 signatures and to comply with all kinds of governance to get something done. So, it could become difficult. So there's a fine balance between the two. And you don't want to create a culture out there that's more worried about, oh, did I follow the rules, rather than actually creating action in the fields. So it's a fine balance. An important point, whatever it is that you do, I think for institutional memory, write it down. There were many administrations before you. They did great things. They may have done things that are not so great, but there's a lot of good things that have been done. If you have policies, or write them down, create a manual with all your policies. You'll make everybody's life a lot easier. Nothing worse than to hear, yeah, we had a policy about that 10 years ago. How come you guys don't know about it? So, so create a manual, document all your policies, and review your constitution and bylaws on a regular basis to make changes, bring it up to date, and or to reflect new practices. I think that's very important. I know some people have constitution that may describe the role of various officers or practices that are archaic. That was done 30 years ago. We don't necessarily work that way anymore. So it's very worthwhile to review your constitution and adapt it to your current practice. And communicate it. If you make decisions at the board level, at the executive committee level, and you have staff, well, remember to tell your staff, because they're the one that will implement it. If they don't hear about it, it's not going to happen. You could have discussed it for 4 hours at night, but make sure you communicate whatever decision you make to your staff. And if you do have professional staff, by all means involve them, because they're the one in the field, and they're the one that basically go to battle for you every day. So you better equip them with the right tools. So communicate and educate. And guess there's a whole culture change out there. So let's try to all be forward-thinking and involve our leadership into the decision-making and the controls, and give the employees or anybody else, working on behalf of the school, the proper tools. And again, I encourage everybody to engage and educate your board, and take them in the process and explain to them what you do in the office. That's my best practices. Do I do all this? I try very hard. And again, I feel like I'm at the helm of the ship for the last 13 years, but I went through several administrations. So it's the education and the communication, I think, is very important. So I'm trying. And I welcome any questions. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Harold. I think there's some wonderful practical suggestions, policies that have been made today. Obviously, depending on the size of your organization, some are more practical than others. Not everyone has paid employees. It really depends on the function of your size and resources. We have a number of questions from online, but are there any questions here in the audience? Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm Eileen from Congregation Oheb Zedek. I never heard of putting batch numbers on the back of the checks. It sounds like a great idea, but in this day and age, it seems very cumbersome. Is it really worth it?
For us, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It's come in handy for us many times. It doesn't really take her a long time. Once she stamps them, she quickly writes it down. And
Because what my bookkeeper does, next to the line item that's being paid by that check, she puts the check number. So hopefully she's typed in the correct check number, and then, you know, if it's in question, we look at it, we refer to the batch, we see that there's documentation. But I just can't imagine going onto something like that, where it's, you know, a one-by-one thing, yet it's a great idea.
I mean, you know, if you have a system that works for you,
Right.
I mean, great. Like for us, this was a good idea. It's been implemented for the last 10 years, and it's been great. It's been used a lot. So.
We do audits of many different shuls, and I would say that there's probably equal number that do it that way and others that don't. So it's up to what you feel to be the benefit, whether it has more advantages than the time that it takes, the disadvantage.
I actually had a question for you. I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Mel.
Do you envision a time where nonprofits of any kind, whether it's a shul or a fundraising arm of some organization, will have to file? It just seems like we need it. Forgive me.
My personal opinion is that I think the separation of church and state will override the, quote, the need of a Form 990 being filed by shuls. Again, there are even yeshivas out there that consider themselves officially to be shuls and thus avoid filing 990, which I think is not the right thing to do. So time will tell, but at this point, certainly, I think the segregation of church and state is very strong.
Question for any one of the panelists. You talk about controlling cash and not to accept cash, but there are many shuls where there are tens of thousands of dollars of cash that comes through a pushka over the course of a year and thousands of dollars a day. What kind of controls would you recommend to put in to make sure that that cash is properly monitored?
Again, I think it's important that the cash be accounted for on a regular basis. If not on a daily basis, certainly on a very frequent basis. No, don't wait a month to account for that. And I think you'll see by accounting for the funds, let's say on a daily basis, you'll see a trend that on a normal weekday you may be getting on the average of X amount of dollars. On a Sunday you may be significantly higher because more people may be coming for whatever reason. I think it's important to account for the funds, to deposit it intact on a regular basis, and just look at the trend and look back at what's happened in order to see if there's any major variance from one period to the other. And I think that is an important control. Obviously, the person that is doing it, maybe you should rotate it, make sure you feel that they are certainly reputable people, don't have any behavioral problems that Harold spoke about. So I think those are the general trends that I would suggest.
I think, like Mel said, it's important who has the control over the pushker and any other cash collections, and what happens to the pushker after the cash is collected in the pushker, because again, it's not practical on a daily basis to empty the pushker and make the deposit maybe once a week, like maybe after Sunday. Monday would be a good point, so this way you have a full week's worth, and Sundays generally every day. You have more people coming to the minyan on Sunday, but the question is what happens to that pushker each and every day after the three times a day that pushker is out there? Who's controlling it? Is it in a locked place? What's the access to it? And more importantly is who's that individual.
Question.
My name is Bernie Simon from Lincoln Square Synagogue, and I have a question with respect to your own staff. How many staff members do you have in the office, and how do you split up the responsibilities with respect to internal control?
Okay. We don't have a big staff. At the moment, I'm the only full-time. I have a part-time bookkeeper, and I had another part-time person. Actually, we're in transition now, looking for somebody. But in terms of control, my bookkeeper does the billings, and well, let me backtrack. I open all the mail, so this way I get to see all the checks, everything that comes in, and I give it to her, and she'll do all the deposits and so forth. In terms of the payables, what we do, I have one person, like say employee one, will vet all the bills, prepare the check request, get the proper authorization from committees and so forth, and she hands me like a folder at the end of the week with everything that's ready to go to the bookkeeper. So I skim through the whole thing. I'll approve every single check request, get the additional information if something is missing, and then after this, once I'm satisfied with it, I give it to the bookkeeper. She cuts the checks. Then it goes to the treasurer and the financial secretary, who are the two people, well, two signatures, and they'll go through the whole material themselves, and then if they're comfortable, they'll sign all the checks. Then it goes back to my number one employee, who will mail them out, but at the same time, she'll check for accuracy if there was a little mistake, or sometimes when you deal with utilities, there's different account numbers for different things, so she'll make sure that the bookkeeper used the right codes and so forth. So she'll, there's a double checking at that time. So to me, like the more people look at it, the better. So you could avoid errors.
Again, segregation of duties is the point you're getting to, is obviously a difficulty when you only have one or two paid employees, but there are many of lay people involved, whether it's on the finance committee or whether it's the treasurer, et cetera, that can participate in segregating some of those duties so that, someone else, one person opens the mail, someone else reviews the bank recs, as was said here. So you need to get other members involved, whether it's board members, finance committee members.
As a follow-up, so the same employee that's entering the data into the computer for payables is the same employee who's entering data in the computer for receivables, or
Correct.
are those
Yes, it's the same person.
We have a question from our online audience. I'm not sure it's a financial question as much as a governance question, but what is the proper way to deal with an individual that is misappropriating funds? At what point should the authorities be notified? Does anybody want to take that?
After you string them up, then call the authorities and maybe they'll pull them down.
I guess at some point in time,
Obviously-
the rabbinic staff should be brought into the situation.
Yes, I was going to say that. Obviously, it's a halacha question, so I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a rabbi, so.
Any other questions? Yes.
Whether it's of a certain amount or a higher amount, because I think you're opening a door for two things. One, things can be misappropriated even in small amounts, which add up. Two, that they shouldn't be brought into question if there's one signature, that people are using the institution for purposes that it shouldn't be used for, and that's why the Jewish Center, we instituted two signatures 25 years ago. And then answer that, I have a second question.
Kol hakavod. If you have the wherewithal to have two signatures, that's wonderful. But there are some places that for small amounts of checks, they feel that as long as within the budget and there's a review even after, assuming that the executive director is authorized to sign checks below, let's pick a number of $500, and it's within the budget. Very often, the treasurer would review all those checks subsequently and just monitor in that fashion. But certainly, it's not always easy to get two signatures. That's why some organizations have a dollar parameter that under a certain level, but everyone does what they feel is best.
It certainly is a best practice to have at least two signatures on every check if you can make it work.
Also, you mentioned something about monies coming in, receivables, for tuitions and for camps. Now, shouldn't that be set up in segregated accounts for that? Because you run into a problem, truthfully, if it goes through the shul, of a possible violation of the 501c3. That it looks like it's a donation, where in fact it's not a donation. And
Question.
therefore it should be segregated.
Well, go ahead.
The receipt.
When
Yeah, but the
you
appearance is,
Yeah,
The
but when
ju-
you issue your tax receipt,
Right.
it's not included. It's-
there's no question about it, but, unless someone is audited, the tax receipt, you don't send in your tax return with your receipts. I mean, I think truthfully, as a matter of practice, it shouldn't appear, and I know there are synagogues who have complementary schools who will not allow the check to be made out to the synagogue. It's made out to a separate account for that very purpose.
It could be made out to a separate account, but when you say made out, it could be deposited in a separate account, but who is it really written out to?
It should be made out, even if it's a synagogue, it should have the indication of nursery school or camp or something on it
Yeah.
for it to be on the check.
Again, if you could get your people who you're providing that service to make out the checks in that fashion, meaning it's made out to XYZ shul dash nursery school, that's wonderful, kol hakavod. In most cases, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing illegal that the checks be made out to the shul itself, as long as you're not a party to a fraud, which means you cannot issue a receipt
I
for
understand
those
that.
items. And again, your first comment, whether it would have a negative impact upon the shul as far as their 501c3 status, the answer is that whether it's a camp, whether it's a school, it's normally part and parcel of activities of larger shuls, and that in itself would not make it not kosher, if you will. You would still get the stamp of the OU. The point is, there's nothing wrong with that.
Also, generally, if you're running a camp or a school, you would have separate bank accounts for them. Your restrictive endorsement would say XYZ shul camp, XYZ shul school. So this way, if the individual was even thinking of using that check as a donation, if they were in the back of their mind, if they're audited, they're going to have to present their canceled checks. Once they look at the endorsement on the back, they're going to realize it wasn't a donation to the synagogue. It was
But the
for a
shul-
fee. It was a fee for service.
The shul is protected if they issue the proper receipt.
I
It's-
understand that, but I don't think you should add encouragement to
Right,
anyone.
Okay.
Question.
Just to answer your question, I think good internal control comes from understanding what the donor's intention is. Is this a donation to this fund, that fund, or is this paying for tuition? And then it has to be booked as such. And if it's not a donation, then it's what we used to consider at Temple Emmanuel, like a sale item, so they don't get a tax receipt. So, that good internal control practice from the start is what really counts. And then there's nothing to worry about.
Question.
Similarly, in our shul, we have a fundraising program where we'll purchase script cards, basically gift certificates to Fairway, and we'll sell them to shul members. Whenever someone buys a Fairway card, they're not entitled to any kind of donation for that. They're buying a good. So, people make checks out to the shul all the time that would not be considered tax deductible. They're not donations. And as Eileen said, as long as they're booked a certain way, and on our communications we say this is not tax deductible, it's not a problem for a shul to receive money that is not necessarily a donation.
Another question online, tax question. Does a shul need to file a W-2 form for a scholar in residence? Or the question is W-2, but the question is, it could be a 1099 more appropriate.
1099.
So the answer is, it depends on the amount of money, that the shul paid for those services. I think what is the,
$600.
anything over $600 technically requires a 1099. So,
600 and over.
600 and over.
yes. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank you all for joining us, for participating. Hopefully, this will be the first of a series. Hopefully, the OU will provide some guidance to those schools who need guidance. Some obviously have, as I said before, greater resources than others. If a school does need some advice about setting up controls that for their particular organization, they should feel free to reach out to the OU, and I'm sure we'll be able to provide some help in that area. Thank you, everyone, and a Shana Tova to everyone.